The light was going thin. Jonas had walked this eastern fence line more times than he could count. 11 years of dusk patrols, 11 years of reading the land the way other men read newspapers, finding the news in a bent branch, a disturbed patch of soil, the particular silence that settled over the grass when something large had passed through recently. He knew this stretch of the Limpopo Reserve the way a person knows a long-held home, not perfectly, but honestly, with all its moods and its contradictions memorized in the body rather than the mind. He walked without hurry. He always walked without hurry out here. The bush did not reward rushing, and it had taught him that lesson more than once in his early years. The evening was dry and cooling quickly, the way it did in this part of the country when the sun dropped below the acacia line and took its warmth with it like something folded away. The sky to the west had gone deep amber, and the grass around him, tall and pale and moving in a wind too faint to feel against his skin, caught the light and held it, glowing in long, soft columns. It was beautiful in the way that ordinary things become beautiful when you have looked at them long enough without needing them to be anything other than what they are. Jonas noticed it the way he always noticed it, quietly and without sentiment, the way a man notices the face of someone he loves across a room. He was checking the integrity of the boundary posts, making notes in the small, worn notebook he carried in his breast pocket, when he became aware of a stillness spreading through the grass to his left. It moved outward from some central point the way ripples move on water, a hush that began somewhere he couldn't see and radiated toward him with a soft, pressing quality. The insects went quiet first, then the late-calling birds, then everything. Jonas stopped walking. He had learned, years ago, to treat that silence not as an absence but as a presence, as the bush communicating through the only channel available to it when language failed. He stood still and let his eyes move slowly across the grass line without forcing them, the way his old mentor Ndlovu had taught him before the man retired. Don't look at it, Ndlovu had told him once. Look around it and let it find you. She found him. She came out of the tall grass without sound, without warning, without any of the behavioral grammar that preceded a lion's approach when that approach was meant to threaten. There was no low roll in the shoulders, no flattening of the ears against the skull, no slow sweeping of the tail that a predator used to calibrate the distance between itself and something it intended to close in on. There was none of that. What there was, instead, was something Jonas had no precise category for: a directness that was not aggression, a steadiness that was not challenge, a movement toward him that felt, in the most unsettling and clarifying way, like a decision. His hand went to his radio. Not in panic, he was not a man who panicked easily, and had not been for many years, but in the deep automatic reflex of a professional whose body stayed several steps ahead of his thinking. He did not raise the radio, he simply held it. She was a large female, fully adult, likely 4 or 5 years old, her coat the color of dry grass and evening dust, her form substantial and fluid in the way of lions that are well-fed and in their prime. She moved at a deliberate pace, not slow, not fast, with the contained energy of something that knew precisely where it was going. Her head was carried slightly lower than it should have been, not the low carriage of a hunting crouch, but something different, something that read more like weight than intention, as though she were carrying something invisible that had been pulling at her for a long time. She stopped 4 meters from him. The distance was close enough that Jonas could hear her breath steady, deep, with a faint roughness at the edges that was not quite a rumble and not quite a sigh. He could see the slow expansion of her ribs. He could see the individual hairs of her muzzle, each one catching the amber light. He could see, in the quality of her gaze, something he would spend a long time trying to find words for afterward. She was looking at him, not through him, the way lions typically processed the presence of people, calculating, measuring, assigning threat values with the cold and efficient logic of a predator. She was looking at him with a quality of attention that felt directed, specific, almost deliberate. Her amber eyes were steady and unhurried, and they held something that Jonas could not name but recognized in the way you recognize a tone of voice before you've understood the words. He did not move. He understood, in the deepest operational part of himself, that stillness was the only honest and appropriate response to what was happening. To move backward would be to break whatever fragile thread of context had brought her here. To move forward was unthinkable. He stood where he was and let the distance between them remain exactly what it was, close enough to see, far enough to mean nothing forceful. She shifted her weight. The movement was small, barely a repositioning, but it sent a visible tremor through her right foreleg, a brief, tight shudder of muscle that she corrected immediately, redistributing her weight to the left, with the practiced ease of something that had been making that same quiet compensation so many times that it had stopped registering as effort. But Jonas registered it. He registered it completely, with the particular quality of attention that comes from years of watching animals carry their pain in silence, because the alternative was to announce it to every predator within range. His eyes dropped briefly to her foreleg. The light was failing now, the amber deepening to rose along the western edge of the sky, and the shadows in the grass were lengthening. He couldn't see clearly, but there was something in the way she held that leg ever so slightly, ever so carefully lifted from its full share of her weight, that settled into his chest and stayed there. She lowered her head. It was a slow movement, unhurried and deliberate, her chin dropping in a line that was neither submissive nor threatening but occupied some quieter register between them, the kind of gesture that was simply honest, that said without drama or decoration, "Here I am." The grass around her paws was pale and dry. She exhaled once, long and low. Jonas let out a slow breath of his own. He let his radio hand drop fractionally, not all the way, but enough. He kept his gaze soft, not direct, not avoidant, resting somewhere in the middle distance of her face, and he let his body settle into the kind of stillness that was not rigid but quiet, the way water is quiet when there is nothing disturbing its surface. "All right," he said softly. One word, low and steady, spoken the way you would speak in a room where someone is sleeping. The reserve held them both in its vast and patient dark. The grass moved. The sky continued its long, slow change, and the lioness stood in the failing light, 4 meters from a man who had stopped everything he was doing to give her his complete and undivided attention, and she did not leave. She waited, as though waiting were what she had come here to do. She turned before he expected her to. It was not a startled movement, not a reorientation triggered by some sound in the grass behind her or some shift in the wind that carried a new scent. It was slow and purposeful, the kind of movement that belongs to a creature that has already decided what it is going to do and is simply doing it now, without ceremony, without hesitation. She pivoted her body in a long, unhurried arc, presenting her right flank to Jonas the way you might set something down in front of another person, not aggressively, not timidly, but with the plain directness of an offering. Jonas did not move. He understood, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that what was being asked of him in this moment was simply to receive, to look, to be present enough and still enough that the information she was giving him could pass between them without distortion. He looked. The light was poor now, the dusk having settled into that particular in-between hour when color drains from the world before darkness properly arrives, when shapes become their own simplified versions and details retreat into suggestion. But the wound was not subtle. Even in the failing light, even at 4 meters, even partially obscured by the dry grass pressing against her leg, it announced itself with the quiet authority of something that had been present for a long time. It was on her lower right foreleg, just above the wrist joint. A snare wound, he knew it immediately. Had seen enough of them over 11 years to recognize the signature without needing to examine it closely. The wire itself was gone, likely worked loose or cut somewhere in the weeks since, but the damage it had left behind was recorded in layers. The flesh around the injury was dark and swollen, the skin broken in a ragged, irregular ring where the wire had pulled and tightened with every step she had taken after it caught her. Dried blood had built up in dark, flaking ridges along the edges of the wound. Around those ridges, the skin had the tight, shining quality of deep infection, stretched and glossy in a way that spoke of pressure building beneath the surface, of a body fighting a battle it had been fighting alone for far too long. Jonas exhaled slowly and held himself very still, not from fear, his fear. Whatever initial spike of it had moved through him when she first emerged from the grass, had settled into something quieter and more functional. He held still because motion, any motion, felt like an intrusion into a moment that was already asking a great deal from both of them. She had turned back to face him now. Her head was level, her amber eyes resting on him with an expression that had no single human translation, but that communicated, unmistakably, a quality of waiting. She was watching him process what she had shown him. Her breathing was even and slow, the rise and fall of her sides visible and regular, and she held the weight off her injured leg with the practiced subtlety of weeks of habit, the shift so ingrained now that it looked almost natural, almost invisible. If you didn't know what you were seeing, he knew what he was seeing. A snare wound 3 weeks old, at minimum, possibly older. He looked at the infection and revised his estimate upward without wanting to. Animals in the wild were exceptional at concealing injury. Evolutionary logic demanded it, because a visible weakness was an invitation to every opportunistic predator in a 20-kilometer radius. That she had concealed this for as long as she had, that she had continued to move through the reserve and navigate her days without slowing enough to draw the attention of the monitoring teams, spoke to a depth of physical endurance that Jonas found difficult to fully absorb. The fact that she was here now, that something had changed in her calculus, that she had overridden the ancient, bone-deep instinct to hide her vulnerability, and had walked instead toward a human in the open, told him that something had shifted, that the wound had crossed some internal threshold she had been holding against, that she had reached the limit of what she could manage alone. He reached slowly for his radio, keeping his movements small and lateral. Nothing sudden, nothing that traveled upward toward his face in a way that could be read as threat. She watched his hand move without flinching. Her ears remained forward, not flattened, which he noted with a relief he didn't allow himself to express. "This is Jonas, Eastern Boundary, Marker 7. His voice came out low and level, occupying as little space in the air as possible. "I need Dr. Amara. Field call, tonight. Adult female, mobile, lower right foreleg snare wound, infected. Looks to be 3 weeks minimum." He paused, and then added something he had never added to a field call before. "She approached me directly. She's still here." The radio returned a brief crackle, then a voice he recognized confirming receipt. He kept his eyes on the Lioness throughout, watching for any change in her posture, any decision gathering in the set of her shoulders or the angle of her ears. There was none. She had absorbed the sound of the radio and the sound of his voice and had simply continued to wait, as though waiting were a thing she had become very good at. He crouched down. Not closer, his feet stayed exactly where they were, but lower, reducing the vertical presence of himself, making his silhouette softer and less imposing against the pale sky behind him. The dry grass bent around his boots. The evening had cooled considerably now, and the air carried the faint metallic edge that he had noticed earlier and understood now with a clarity that sat heavily behind his sternum. She watched him crouch, her head turned fractionally, following the movement without alarm, and then settled back to its level position. Her tail moved once, a single slow sweep along the ground behind her, not the agitated lashing of a threatened animal, but the low, almost absent motion of something deep in thought, or deep in exhaustion, or some combination of the two that the wild produced in creatures who had been carrying too much for too long. The light had nearly gone. The grass around them was silver gray now, the sky above a deep blue that was darkening toward black at its upper edges. Somewhere far to the north, something called once and fell silent. The bush had the quality of held breath, of a space that understood something significant was occurring within it, and had adjusted its volume accordingly. Jonas looked at the wound one more time across the dimming distance between them. He looked at the dried layers, the swollen flesh, the faint gleam of infection in what remained of the light. He looked at the cost of it, the weeks of silent endurance written into her body with a faithfulness that moved him in a way he couldn't have explained and didn't try to. Then he looked at her face, at the amber eyes steady in the dark, at the patience in them enormous, exhausted, and still somehow intact. He did not speak again. There was nothing to say that would have added anything to what was already present between them in the cooling grass, in the near dark, in the long and quiet fact of her remaining. Dr. Amara arrived before the last of the light was fully gone. Jonas heard the vehicle before he saw it, the low sound of an engine running without headlights, moving slowly along the service track that ran parallel to the eastern fence line, navigating by familiarity rather than illumination. It was exactly the kind of arrival he had hoped for, and had not needed to request specifically, because Amara had been doing this long enough to understand that how you came toward a wild animal in distress was not a secondary concern. It was the work itself, begun before you stepped out of the cab. The vehicle rolled to a stop 50 meters back. A door opened and closed with the careful quietness of deliberate restraint. Then footsteps, soft, measured, the pace of someone who had trained themselves out of urgency a long time ago and replaced it with something more useful. Amara moved through the dimming grass toward Jonas with the particular quality of attention she always brought into the field, present, unhurried. Her eyes already gathering information from a distance, already reading the scene with the practiced efficiency of 14 years of wildlife medicine. She was a compact woman with close-cropped hair and hands that Jonas had watched perform extraordinary things in difficult conditions with nothing more than concentration and care. She stopped beside him without speaking first and looked at the lioness, who had not moved from her position in the time it had taken Amara to arrive. Jonas gave her the information in low, economical sentences: the approach, the duration, the wound's location, and what he could assess of its depth from where he had been standing. The fact that the lioness had remained voluntarily through the radio call, through the sound of the vehicle, through the arrival of a stranger. Amara listened without interrupting, her eyes moving between Jonas and the animal with steady, calibrating attention. Then she was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet she made the set of decisions that field veterinarians made in the dark with incomplete information and no margin for second guessing. Dose, distance, approach angle, team positioning. 2 members of the response team had followed her on foot from the vehicle, carrying the dart equipment in a case that they held low and still at their sides. They were young men, both trained on this reserve, both familiar enough with Amara's fieldwork rhythms to need very little instruction. She spoke to them briefly, her voice barely above a murmur, and they separated to take their positions with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that every unnecessary sound was a cost paid by the animal in front of them. The lioness watched all of this. Her head had lifted fractionally when the footsteps arrived, her ears orienting toward the new presences with the alert precision of a predator's hearing. But she had not risen. She had not shifted her body into any of the postures of threat or retreat. She sat in the tall, pale grass with her weight distributed carefully away from her injured leg and regarded the expanding group of humans in her vicinity with an attentiveness that was, in every observable way, more evaluative than hostile. Amara prepared the dart herself, working with small, deliberate movements, her kit open on the ground at her feet. She calibrated the dose toward the lower end of the effective range. She always did this. Had strong feelings about it, felt that over-sedation was a kind of carelessness that the animal paid for long after the procedure was finished. The dart was loaded and she took her position. The distance was appropriate. The angle was clean. She exhaled once and was still, and then the dart was away. The lioness startled at the sting, a single sharp flinch, a sudden coming to her feet with a speed that demonstrated, briefly and completely, that the weeks of injury had not diminished her fundamental power. She was on her feet in one fluid motion, her body turning in a tight half-circle, her head swinging to locate the source of the sudden pain. A low sound moved through her chest, not quite a growl, something shorter and more surprised than that. Then the chemistry began its quiet work. It moved through her the way all sedatives move through large animals from the edges inward, a heaviness accumulating in the limbs first, a softening of the joints, a gradual surrender of the extraordinary muscular coordination that kept her upright and capable. She took 3 steps that were increasingly uncertain, her right foreleg dragging its familiar hesitation alongside this new, pharmaceutical unsteadiness. She turned once more, and the turn was slower this time, and her head dropped lower. She went down the way Jonas would always remember, not collapsing, not falling, but lowering. A slow and almost deliberate descent into the grass, as though some part of her biology was still managing the process, still insisting on doing this with dignity. Her hindquarters settled first, then her forequarters, and then she was lying on her side in the tall, pale grass with her ribs rising and falling in the deep, steady rhythm of sedated breath. The team moved forward immediately, but without haste, the pace of people who understood that urgency and rush were not the same thing. Amara was first, kneeling at the lioness's side within seconds, her hands already gloved, her kit already open beside her. She checked pulse, checked airway, checked the quality of the sedation with the focused efficiency of someone for whom these steps were as natural as breathing. Jonas came to the lioness's head. He had done this before, sat at the heads of sedated animals while veterinary work was carried out around them, and he had developed, over years, a quiet practice for these moments. He did not touch, he did not crowd, he simply placed himself in the animal's immediate space as a consistent, calm presence. Something steady and non-threatening for whatever fragment of awareness remained active beneath the sedation. But tonight he did something he had not done before, or not in quite this way. He reached out slowly, with the full awareness of everyone present, and placed one hand on the ground beside the lioness's right forepaw. Not on it, beside it, close enough that the warmth of contact existed at the very edge of possibility, without crossing into presumption. She did not flinch, her paw did not draw back. The slow, deep rhythm of her breathing continued unchanged, and her amber eyes, half open now and heavy with the sedative's pull, did not sharpen or shift. "That's it," Amara said softly, not to Jonas, not to the lioness, but to no one in particular, the quiet acknowledgement of a professional who had seen many things in the field and understood, without needing to perform the understanding, that what was happening in this circle of lamplight in the darkening bush was worth acknowledging. The lamp cast its warm circle into the surrounding dark. The grass moved at the edges. The reserve continued its enormous, indifferent life all around them, and within it, this small and careful gathering of people held their attention on a single animal and gave her, in the only ways available to them, everything they had. Amara worked in the focused and unhurried way that defined everything she did in the field. The wound was worse at close proximity than it had appeared from a distance, which was what Jonas had expected, and what Amara had prepared for without knowing the specifics. She cleaned it in careful stages, beginning at the outer edges and working inward with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the temptation to rush toward the center of a problem was usually the thing that caused the most damage. The layers of dried blood came away slowly under her hands, each one revealing something older beneath it, and the full extent of the infection became visible in the lamplight with a clarity that made the team's silence deepen without any of them acknowledging it directly. The wire had been gone for some time. Whatever had removed it, whether she had worked it free herself against rock or bark, or whether some human hand had been involved in some earlier partial encounter that had never been reported, the physical snare was absent. But the recording of it remained in the flesh with absolute fidelity. The wound was deep, the tissue around the core of it darkened and compromised, the infection established across a broader area than the surface alone suggested. Amara noted all of this without expression, cataloging it in the efficient internal registry she had built over years of field medicine, and continued to work. Jonas remained at the lioness's head. He had not shifted from his position since she went down, his hands still resting on the ground beside her forepaw, in the same attitude of quiet presence he had taken when she first settled into the grass. He watched Amara work with the attentiveness of a man who respected the discipline of what he was witnessing, and he listened to the night around them with the other, older part of his attention, the part that never fully rested, that monitored the texture of the bush's sounds the way a sailor monitors the behavior of water. It was this part of him that noticed it first. He had been aware, in a peripheral way, of a faint movement at the edges of the lamplight's reach, something in the low thicket to the northeast, in the direction from which the lioness had originally emerged. He had noted it and set it aside twice, attributing it to wind, to the natural settling of vegetation in the cooling night air, to the small, ordinary movements of the bush that accumulated into a continuous background of almost motion. But the third time, the movement had a quality to it that was different, not wind, not settling, something with intention in it, however small and cautious. He reached for his flashlight slowly. The movement kept low and lateral, and swept the beam toward the thicket. The light found them immediately, and Jonas went absolutely still. 3 cubs, tucked into the base of the low brush in a tight cluster, their small bodies pressed together with the instinctive communal warmth of very young animals who understood almost nothing about the world yet except the fundamental comfort of contact. They were tiny, no older than 6 weeks, he estimated, possibly less. Their coats still carried the heavy spotted camouflage of lion infancy, dark rosettes against pale gold that would fade as they grew, but now served as near-perfect concealment in the dappled shadow of the thicket's base. They had not moved when the light found them. The oldest of the three, marginally larger, positioned at the outer edge of the cluster, had its small face oriented directly toward the beam with the wide, unblinking seriousness of a young animal that had not yet learned to fully process threat, that was still operating on the primary instructions of stay still and stay together. Its eyes reflected the flashlight in two small bright points. The other two were pressed behind it, their shapes visible only as a denser darkness at the thicket's base. Jonas did not speak. He held the light steady and reached across with his other hand and touched Amara's arm. She looked up from the wound. He moved the flashlight beam a fraction to indicate direction. She followed it and saw what he had found, and the instrument in her hand lowered slowly to her knee. The two response team members, positioned on either side of the working area, had both tracked the movement of the flashlight and arrived at the same understanding within the same few seconds. No one spoke. The silence that settled over the group in that moment was different from the professional quiet they had been maintaining throughout the procedure. It was denser, more involuntary, the kind of stillness that descends on people when something has just rearranged their understanding of the situation they are in. The Lioness had been carrying this wound for weeks. She had hunted on it, navigated the reserve on it, endured its worsening through the incremental deterioration of days that had accumulated into the deep infection now spread across her foreleg. She had done all of this without slowing enough to trigger the monitoring systems that were specifically designed to identify animals in distress. She had managed it with a silence and a discipline that spoke of extreme endurance, and she had managed it alone. She had managed it for them. The cubs were too young to survive without her. 6 weeks old, still dependent on her entirely for warmth and milk and protection, unable to regulate their own temperature adequately, unable to defend themselves against any of the dozen predators that moved through this reserve after dark. They needed her mobile and feeding and present, and she had known not in the way a human knows things, not with language or reflection, but in the deep biological certainty of a mother animal that she was approaching a point at which she would no longer be capable of being those things. And so she had made the only calculation available to her. She had weighed the enormous, species-deep instinct toward concealment against the immediate survival needs of 3 animals that were entirely dependent on her continued function, and she had walked out of the grass toward a man she had observed but never approached, and she had waited. Jonas looked at the cubs for a long time. The oldest had not moved from its position at the thicket's edge, still watching the lamp and the humans arranged around its mother's still form with that concentrated, unreadable seriousness. The two behind it were a soft, barely visible mass of warmth and spotted fur, their small sides rising and falling in the rhythm of sleep or something close enough to it to be indistinguishable. He looked down at the Lioness, at the great still weight of her in the grass, her amber eyes at half-mast, her breathing deep and regular beneath Amara's hands, at the wound that had cost her so much and that was now, finally, being addressed. "Finish the work," Amara said quietly. To herself as much as anyone, she picked up her instrument and returned her attention to the wound with a steadiness that Jonas recognized as the professional's response to being moved, not suppressing the feeling, but directing it into the hands, into the precision of what they were doing, making the emotion useful. The lamplight held its small, warm circle in the dark. The cubs remained where they were, patient and still, waiting in the only way they knew. The darkness before dawn is the quietest the bush ever gets. It is a different quiet from the one that falls at dusk, less like an arrival and more like a held breath, the whole landscape suspended in the last moments before light begins its slow reclamation of the world. The insects that had kept their steady chorus through the night had tapered to occasional, solitary calls. The grass stood motionless in the still air. The sky above the reserve had shifted from black to a deep, depthless blue at its eastern edge, a change so gradual it was impossible to identify the exact moment it began. Jonas had not slept. He had not expected to. He had spent the remaining hours of the night the way he spent most nights in the field when rest was unavailable, in a state of quiet, functional wakefulness, his body still and his attention moving slowly through the sounds around him, monitoring without urgency. The response team had rotated in shifts, one always awake and Amara had dozed briefly against the vehicle's rear wheel with the practiced efficiency of a person who had learned to extract recovery from whatever fragments of time the work provided. The cubs had remained in the thicket throughout, invisible in the dark, their presence known only by the occasional faint sound, a soft shifting, a barely audible vocalization so quiet it barely qualified as sound at all, more a texture in the air than anything the ear could cleanly resolve. The lioness had moved through her recovery in the way large cats move through sedation slowly, non-linearly, the consciousness returning in uneven increments rather than a clean and steady progression. Her paws had begun to flex and contract in the early hours of the morning, small repetitive movements that Amara had noted and confirmed were part of the normal emergence sequence. Her breathing had changed pitch and rhythm sometime around 3 in the morning, becoming lighter and more variable. By 4, her head had lifted twice from the grass, held its position for a few seconds, with the unfocused intensity of an animal reassembling its awareness from scattered pieces, and then lowered again. At the first real suggestion of dawn, that pale, uncertain luminosity that preceded the actual color of sunrise by 20 minutes or more, she raised her head a third time and kept it up. Her eyes had lost the heavy, half-present quality of sedation. They were clear now, amber and sharp, moving across the scene around her with the restored precision of a predator's full attention. She took in the team members at their respectful distance. She took in the vehicle. She took in the changed quality of the light and the altered smell of the air that came with it. Her ears moved in slow, deliberate arcs, gathering information, processing, updating. Then she gathered her legs beneath her and stood. The movement was effortful, not dramatically so, not the struggling rise of an animal in crisis, but the careful, deliberate effort of a body reclaiming its full function after a long and demanding night. She stood on all 4 legs and was still for a moment, and Jonas watched her test the weight on her injured foreleg with an attention so focused it had become something close to prayer. The leg held. She shifted more weight onto it, incrementally, and the leg continued to hold. The dressing Amara had applied was clean and intact, and the swelling, while unchanged in these first hours, no longer carried the tight and dangerous shine of active, unaddressed infection. The team had already moved back during her emergence, creating a corridor of distance between themselves and her that was wide enough to mean safety and respectful enough to mean something more than that. Amara stood at Jonas's left shoulder, watching with the quiet assessment of someone performing a final field evaluation that no chart or form could fully capture. One of the younger team members carried the cubs forward now. He had retrieved them from the thicket with extreme care in the last hour of darkness, lifting each one with both hands in the way Amara had demonstrated, fully supported, held close to the body, transferred quickly into a lined carry bag that held all 3 together so that their warmth and contact remained uninterrupted. They had not struggled significantly. They were young enough that the world had not yet fully differentiated itself into categories of safe and unsafe, and the handling had been careful enough that it had not taught them otherwise. He set the bag down on the ground at the edge of the space between the team and the lioness and stepped back without ceremony, the motion clean and quiet and complete. She found them immediately. Her head swung toward the bag with the absolute directness of a mother's biological orientation. No searching, no uncertainty, just the immediate and total reorientation of every sense toward the thing that mattered most. She crossed the space between herself and the bag in 4 steps, her injured leg carrying its weight with the careful deliberateness of something relearning its own capability, and she lowered her head to the opening. The oldest cub emerged first, pulling itself forward on its oversized paws with the clumsy, effortful determination of an animal that was very small and very motivated. It pressed its face into her muzzle, and she held there, still, her nose moving along its head and neck in long, slow passes. Then the second cub, then the third. She attended to each one in turn with the same thorough, unhurried investigation, reading each small body with her nose the way a person might read a page they had been waiting a long time to return to, confirming every detail, reassuring herself of every particular. The cubs pressed against her legs, moved under her chin, oriented themselves around her body with the blind and absolute confidence of animals for whom she was the only fixed point in the universe. Jonas watched all of this without moving. When she had finished her inventory of the cubs, When she had confirmed each one to her own satisfaction and settled them into the loose formation of a family preparing to move, she lifted her head. She looked at the grass line ahead of her, at the route back into the reserve's interior where the thicket and the dawn light and whatever remained of her established territory waited. She looked at the pale sky. She looked at the long grass catching the first real color of the morning, gold beginning to seep into the gray. And then she turned and looked directly at Jonas. It lasted only a few seconds. Her amber eyes found his across the distance between them with a clarity and a directness that had no ambiguity in it. That was neither threat nor performance, nor the uncertain assessment of an animal deciding whether to tolerate a presence. It was something quieter and more complete than any of those things, a look that arrived and settled, and then, in its own time, released. She turned back to her cubs. She moved them with her body the way she always had, the slow pivot, the guiding presence, the unhurried authority of a mother in full function. They moved with her, clustering around her legs, and together they walked into the tall, pale grass as the sun broke the horizon and poured its first gold light across the reserve in long, level lines. The grass closed behind them without a sound. Jonas stood in the growing warmth of the morning with his hands at his sides and the light moving slowly across the ground at his feet, and he did not speak, and no one around him asked him to. The reserve stretched away in every direction, enormous and unchanged and full of its own continuing life, and somewhere inside it, a lioness walked her cubs home through the gold.